They begged her to settle, but she wanted her children's future protected for the children, yet the moment she placed the sealed custody and trust legal file on the lawyer's table inside the downtown Chicago family courtroom, everything everyone believed about peaceful resolution collapsed into something far more uncomfortable: documentation that refused to lie. The envelope wasn't dramatic at first glance. Just a simple manila file with a courthouse stamp, slightly worn at the edges, the kind of object most people would ignore if they didn't understand that in American legal disputes, power is never in the voice, it is in what has already been signed before anyone starts talking. Emily Carter sat quietly at the center of it all, a younger white American woman in her early 30s, dressed in modest office clothing, her hands resting still on the edge of the table like she had already accepted that emotions would not decide this room. Across from her, attorneys adjusted their papers, and family representatives leaned in with the same expectation they always brought into these cases: that pressure would eventually replace proof. That she would eventually break. That she would eventually do what's reasonable. Behind Emily, almost unnoticed at first, stood Walter Gaines, a quiet white billionaire in his late 60s, dressed in an understated luxury suit that never tried to announce his wealth. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. People like him didn't measure situations by who was loudest, they measured them by who had kept the record straight long before the conflict ever began. The case, on the surface, looked simple to the opposing side. A custody settlement in dispute. A family agreement under review. A financial arrangement tied to a trust structure that everyone claimed they understood. But beneath that surface was something far more precise: a custody and financial trust framework designed years earlier, with clauses that determined not just where the children lived, but how their financial protection would survive disagreement, pressure, and even attempted settlement under emotional stress. That was the part no one in the opposing group wanted to fully acknowledge. They had built their argument on presence, not structure. On emotion, not documentation. On assumption, not legal continuity. One of the attorneys finally spoke, sliding a printed settlement proposal across the table toward Emily. The language was carefully chosen, words like mutual agreement, co-parenting stability, and final resolution. But the real message underneath was simpler: sign now, and the conflict ends. Do not question the structure. Do not reopen the file. Do not delay the process. Just settle. Emily didn't touch the paper. Her eye stayed on the sealed custody and trust file instead, the one that had been sitting on the lawyer's table since the beginning of the session. Because that file contained the only thing that actually mattered in this room: legal authority over her children's future. Not emotional arguments. Not family pressure. Not social perception of what a good settlement should look like. Walter observed silently as opposing counsel continued to speak, referencing stability, financial predictability, and the need to avoid prolonged litigation costs. It was a familiar pattern to him. In high-pressure family and estate disputes, people often confuse urgency with correctness. They believe that if they can make someone tired enough, stressed enough, or socially isolated enough, that person will eventually sign away rights just to restore peace. But peace built on compromised documentation is not peace at all, it is deferred loss. Emily's situation was different only because she understood something the others were misreading. This was not a negotiation about feelings. It was a structure defined by trust law, custody orders, and financial protection clauses that did not bend to persuasion. Somewhere in the file sat records of financial responsibility allocation, mortgage-linked custody protection terms, and beneficiary structures tied directly to the children's future. And unlike verbal agreements, those elements did not change simply because someone asked for them to be simplified. As the courtroom clerk prepared additional documents for review, a subtle shift moved through the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was the realization beginning to form that Emily Carter was not resisting settlement out of stubbornness or emotion. She was refusing it because she understood exactly what would be lost if the structure was signed away too early. And that was the detail no one had accounted for. She wasn't reacting to pressure like someone being cornered. She was responding like someone who had already read the entire system in advance. Walter finally glanced at her, not with instruction, but with quiet confirmation. because he already recognized the pattern forming in the document sitting between them and everyone else in the room. A pattern where the truth was not going to be decided by persuasion, but by what had already been legally recorded long before anyone begged her to settle. Outside the courthouse, the reality of the case did not feel like the dramatic arguments inside the hearing room. It felt like everyday American life layered with financial pressure that most people never talk about out loud: a suburban home with a monthly mortgage statement due in 12 days, a joint bank account that had been monitored line by line since the separation, insurance bills stacked next to grocery receipts, and custody schedules printed like payroll reports, because in cases like this, life stops being emotional and becomes procedural. Emily Carter moved through that world quietly. To most people in her extended family, she still looked like the least powerful person in the room: no flashy job title, no visible wealth, no loud confidence that signaled control. Just a young white American woman in her early 30s, usually dressed in simple office clothing, carrying folders instead of status. That was exactly why they underestimated her. They saw softness. They assumed absence of leverage. What they didn't see was the structure she had spent years learning how to read: bank records, trust allocations, mortgage-linked custody protections, and legal filings that quietly determined who actually carried financial responsibility when relationships broke down. In the days leading up to the next hearing, Emily spent mornings in a small law office near the county courthouse, sitting across from printed custody schedules, financial disclosure statements, and trust documentation that most people would skim, but she studied line by line. She didn't talk much during those sessions. She didn't need to. Every page told her something others kept missing: ownership is not declared in emotion, it is recorded in structure. Across town, the suburban house that had once felt like a shared family space now functioned like a financial checkpoint. Every expense tied back to something documented. Who paid the mortgage? Who covered the utilities during separation? Who maintained the children's school accounts? Even the smallest transactions, groceries, medical co-pays, car insurance, became part of a larger record trail that would eventually determine custody stability and financial responsibility. This was the part most people outside these cases never understand: custody disputes in America are not just about where children sleep. They are about who has been financially and structurally responsible when no one was watching. That is why Emily's silence often frustrated the opposing side. They expected emotion. They expected reaction. They expected her to collapse under social pressure, especially when family members framed her refusal to settle as selfish or unreasonable. But Emily had learned something different from watching the legal system closely over time: pressure is not evidence, and urgency is not truth. Meanwhile, Walter Gaines remained a quiet presence in the background of her case. The billionaire mentor figure did not intervene, did not offer dramatic assistance, and never attempted to fix anything for her. Instead, he observed patterns: how attorneys framed settlements, how financial documents were interpreted under stress, how quickly people confused negotiation pressure with legal reality. In his world, wealth was never about display. It was about understanding which documents actually controlled outcomes long before anyone entered a courtroom. One afternoon, after a procedural meeting at the law office, Walter glanced at the custody and trust file that still remained central to the case. It hadn't been fully opened in court yet, but everyone involved knew it was coming. That file contained something the opposing side had been quietly trying to minimize from the beginning: the original trust structure tied to the children's financial protection, including allocation records, responsibility clauses, and signature hierarchies that would determine whether any settlement could even legally stand as valid under pressure conditions. The opposing attorneys had already begun shaping their narrative around reasonable compromise and mutual resolution, but narratives do not override documentation. And that was the tension building beneath every conversation, every filing, every polite request to just settle. Because the moment that sealed file was fully reviewed in court, one of two things would happen: either the settlement narrative would hold, or the entire assumption about who held legal continuity in the children's future would collapse under verified records. Emily did not speak about it openly. She didn't need to. She simply continued organizing every document, every statement, every record of responsibility with quiet precision. And as the next court date approached, the biggest lie in the entire case was still standing unchallenged in public perception, that she had no real leverage, no real protection, and no real authority to refuse settlement. The sealed custody and trust file sitting with the court clerk was about to decide whether that belief survived contact with the truth. In cases like Emily Carter's, the most dangerous thing in the room was never the legal filing, it was the assumptions people made before reading it. In the days leading up to the next court session, the tension inside the county courthouse system wasn't just about custody schedules or trust allocations anymore. It was about perception versus structure, and how quickly one can collapse when confronted with documented reality. Most of the opposing sides still believed the same core assumptions that had carried them through every previous negotiation, that she was emotionally overwhelmed, financially dependent, and structurally weak compared to the family network pushing for settlement. But those assumptions were not based on records. They were based on appearances. And appearances are not enforceable in court. The first false belief was simple: people dressed modestly must be financially powerless. Emily, with her quiet wardrobe and lack of visible status, was constantly underestimated. Yet behind every decision she made was a paper trail, bank statements, trust allocation summaries, mortgage-linked custody documentation, and legal filings that showed responsibility far more clearly than any outward lifestyle could. In American legal systems, ownership does not belong to the person who looks wealthy. It belongs to the person whose name is tied to enforceable records. The second belief was even more dangerous: silence equals weakness. Emily rarely spoke in meetings. She didn't argue in emotional bursts. She didn't try to win rooms socially. To the opposing family members and attorneys, that silence looked like hesitation. In reality, it was preparation. Every document she held had already been reviewed, cross-checked, and structured before she entered any discussion. In contrast, the loudest voices in the room were often reacting in real time, building arguments from pressure instead of documentation. Then there was the confusion between living in a home and owning the structure behind it. To the outside world, the suburban house tied to the custody case looked like a shared symbol of stability. But legally, stability is not defined by occupancy, it is defined by mortgage responsibility records, deed structures, and trust-linked ownership terms. Emily understood that distinction better than most people in the room, because she had spent years reading what others signed without reading closely. Another false assumption was that family connection automatically equals financial rights. In disputes like this, relatives often speak as if emotional proximity creates legal entitlement. But inheritance structures, custody trusts, and estate protections are not based on closeness, they are based on named beneficiaries, recorded obligations, and enforceable agreements. The difference between being part of a family and being legally protected is written in documents, not spoken in conversations. Even in the business world parallels of this case, the same misunderstanding appears. People often assume a CEO title equals actual creation or ownership of value. But in legal and financial terms, control belongs to those who built the structure, funded the operations, or hold the contractual authority. Titles can be assigned. Ownership is recorded. Cash flow reveals responsibility, not reputation. One of the most repeated illusions in the case was the idea that emotional pressure should influence legal settlement. Family members repeatedly framed settlement as the mature choice, the peaceful option, or what's best for everyone. But in structured financial custody systems, pressure does not rewrite rights. It only tests whether someone understands what they are about to sign away. Emily understood that difference clearly. What looked like emotional resistance from her side was actually legal awareness. She was refusing to convert pressure into permanent loss of custody-linked financial protection. A question naturally emerges here, especially for anyone watching this kind of situation unfold from the outside. How often do we mistake urgency for truth, or assume confidence means correctness when in reality it may only reflect who spoke first? This entire conflict was moving toward one unavoidable point: the sealed custody and trust legal file that had been sitting with the court clerk since the beginning of the proceedings. Inside that file were the mechanisms that would determine whether settlement pressure had any legal standing at all: trust allocation structures, responsibility hierarchies, signature validation records, and financial continuity protections tied directly to the children's future. Once reviewed, those documents would not reflect opinions, emotions, or negotiations. They would reflect structure. And structure, in American family and financial law, is what ultimately decides who is protected when everything else is questioned. In custody and inheritance-related financial disputes like the one surrounding Emily Carter, the entire case often comes down to one uncomfortable truth: most people understand money emotionally, but the law understands it structurally. And once you step into a county courthouse in the United States, emotion stops being the deciding factor. Documentation takes over. The first principle is simple but often misunderstood: a will only controls distribution when it is legally valid, properly signed, and consistent with probate requirements. Without that, it is just paper with intentions written on it. That is why attorneys in Emily's case kept circling back to the sealed custody and trust legal file. Somewhere inside that file were documents that could determine whether prior assumptions about settled agreements even had legal weight. The second principle is ownership versus occupancy. A deed is not symbolic, it is definitive. It shows who legally owns property, regardless of who lives in it, maintains it, or emotionally associates with it. In Emily's situation, the suburban home tied to custody discussions was constantly referenced as a shared family asset in conversation, but legally, what mattered was whose name appeared on the deed structure and how that structure interacted with the trust arrangement. Then there is the mortgage assumption most people get wrong. Making payments does not automatically equal ownership. Mortgage history simply shows financial responsibility, not legal title. In the courthouse discussions, attorneys on both sides reference payment behavior as if it proved control, but in reality, it only showed who carried the burden, not who held authority. That distinction is often where settlement pressure begins to collapse under scrutiny. Bank records add another layer. They don't tell stories, they show patterns. In Emily's case, financial disclosure statements and trust-linked banking documentation were being reviewed to determine who actually supported the children's stability during separation. These records often reveal more truth than any verbal testimony, because they cannot be reshaped by persuasion in a courtroom setting. Contracts operate under the same principle. A contract is not just paper, it is power assigned through signatures, clauses, and enforceable terms. But the critical detail many people miss is that pressure can distort interpretation. That is why courts carefully examine whether agreements were signed under informed and voluntary conditions. In this case, the sealed custody and trust file contained clauses that could determine whether prior settlement attempts were even valid under legal standards. At one point during preparation for the next hearing, Emily and her attorney reviewed a chain of old emails connected to earlier custody discussions. This is where modern legal disputes often become unexpectedly clear. An old email can establish authorship, intent, and timeline in ways that testimony cannot. It can show who proposed terms, who accepted responsibility, and who attempted to redefine agreements after the fact. Walter Gaines, the quiet billionaire observing from the background, focused less on emotion and more on structure. He understood a principle most people only learn through experience: boardroom titles, family roles, and social authority do not erase receipts. They do not override records. They do not replace documented responsibility. In financial systems, whether corporate or familial, paper trails determine reality long after conversations fade. Even payroll-style documentation appeared in Emily's review process, not as employment data, but as a metaphor for how responsibility is distributed over time. In legal custody structures, consistency matters. Who consistently supported expenses? Who maintained obligations? Who fulfilled recorded responsibilities when pressure increased? Those answers are rarely found in arguments, they are found in spreadsheets, statements, and filings. Fine print is where most cases are decided long before court arguments begin. One clause can protect a child's future financial structure. One sentence can invalidate a settlement. One overlooked signature detail can shift responsibility entirely. That is why Emily treated every page of the custody and trust file as if it carried legal weight equal to testimony. As the next hearing approached, one final procedural step remained: the full judicial review of the sealed custody and trust legal file sitting with the clerk. It had not yet been opened in its entirety in open court. Its contents were still partially unknown to those applying pressure for settlement. But once that file was formally introduced into evidence, every assumption built on emotion, urgency, or social pressure would have to be measured against something far less flexible: documented legal structure. And what was inside that sealed file had already begun to quietly shift the balance of the entire case, even before anyone had read it aloud. The sealed custody and trust legal file had been sitting at the center of the case for days, but in the quiet procedural pause before the next hearing, it finally became something more than just an object on a clerk's desk. It became the point where assumptions started to break. Inside that file, still not fully disclosed in open court, were multiple layers of documentation that explained why Emily Carter had refused to settle under pressure, even when nearly everyone around her insisted it was the reasonable choice. The first layer was a set of trust protection documents tied directly to the children's future financial structure. They were not dramatic on the surface, just pages of legal formatting, signatures, and allocation clauses, but their meaning was absolute. They defined how resources would be preserved, how responsibilities would be distributed, and under what conditions any settlement could even be considered valid. To most people in the room, these pages looked like paperwork. To anyone who understood financial law, they were authority. Alongside them was a mortgage-linked responsibility record that showed something the opposing side had repeatedly overlooked: financial contribution did not equal legal control, but it did establish structured accountability over time. The document quietly mapped who had carried obligations during separation periods, and how those obligations interacted with custody protections. It did not accuse anyone. It simply recorded reality. There was also a tax and estate filing receipt chain that connected financial responsibility to legal continuity. These records didn't speak in emotion or narrative, they spoke in timestamps, filings, and verified submissions. They showed who maintained compliance with financial obligations tied to the trust structure, and who did not. But the document that drew the most attention when briefly referenced was a sealed letter attached near the back of the file, bearing an older signature, one that predated the conflict entirely. It wasn't yet fully read aloud in court, but its existence alone shifted attention in the room. Because sealed letters in legal custody structures often contain intent that was established before disputes began, and intent, when properly documented, can reshape how later actions are interpreted. Emily Carter sat through all of this without visible reaction. She did not lean forward when attorneys discussed settlement pressure. She did not respond when family members quietly suggested she was being difficult or emotional. She simply observed, calm and controlled, as if she had already read every page long before anyone else decided to open the file. To the opposing side, that silence was still being misread. They assumed she lacked leverage because she did not perform power the way they expected: no public authority, no financial display, no aggressive legal posture designed for intimidation. In their eyes, she was still the younger woman in modest clothing sitting quietly in a courtroom full of professionals and family representatives who believed they controlled the narrative. What they did not see was preparation. From across the room, Walter Gaines watched the situation unfold with the same quiet focus he had maintained since the beginning. He didn't intervene, and he didn't need to. His attention was on structure, not conversation. He had already recognized something most people in the room were still resisting: Emily wasn't trying to win arguments. She was waiting for documentation to speak. In a separate review session earlier that morning, she had carefully gone through the same custody and trust file line by line with her attorney. No emotion, no escalation, just verification. She checked signatures. She cross-referenced financial records. She reviewed clauses that most people would rush past in search of conclusions. Because she understood something that the courtroom pressure environment often distorts: truth in legal systems is not revealed through intensity, but through consistency. People who understand money and legal structure do not win by being louder than everyone else in the room. They win by keeping records when no one is watching, by reading terms instead of assuming intent, and by letting proof arrive at the exact moment when assumptions become too confident to defend. That is why Emily did not react when others tried to define her position for her. She already knew her position was not defined by perception, it was defined by what was written, signed, and filed long before the conflict ever reached the courthouse. As the next hearing approached, pressure inside and outside the courtroom began to increase again. Family members prepared new arguments. Attorneys recalibrated settlement language. Social expectations were quietly weaponized once more under the idea of what's best for the children. But none of those pressures could change what was already inside the sealed custody and trust legal file now awaiting full judicial review. And once that file was officially opened in court, the entire direction of the case would no longer be shaped by opinion, but by what had already been recorded in black and white before anyone tried to rewrite the story. As the next custody hearing approached, the atmosphere inside the county courthouse in Chicago began to shift from procedural calm into something heavier, pressure disguised as resolution. Everyone involved in the case surrounding Emily Carter understood the stakes differently, but most of the opposing voices in the room were still anchored in the same strategy: apply enough emotional and social pressure, and she would eventually agree to settle. In the conference room outside the courtroom, attorneys rehearsed language designed to sound reasonable but function as leverage. Words like cooperative parenting, mutual compromise, and efficient resolution filled the air, but underneath those phrases was a consistent goal: reduce resistance, secure agreement, and finalize terms before deeper legal scrutiny of the custody and trust structure could fully unfold. Emily sat quietly at the edge of the table during one of these pre-hearing discussions. To the family members present, she still appeared like the least powerful person in the room: no corporate title, no visible wealth, no aggressive legal posture. Some even described her indirectly as emotional, unpredictable, or too focused on control. In reality, she had been the only one consistently focused on documentation rather than interpretation. The opposition leaned into that perception heavily. One of the attorneys casually referenced her as just the mother in dispute, a phrase carefully chosen to reduce her legal standing into something emotional rather than structural. Another family representative suggested she was overcomplicating a simple settlement, implying that cooperation meant signing quickly and moving on without further review. But every time those assumptions were repeated, they collided with something they had not yet fully opened: the sealed custody and trust legal file still waiting for full judicial review. From across the room, Walter Gaines observed the dynamic without interruption. His presence remained understated, almost neutral, but his attention was sharp. He had seen this pattern before in estate disputes, business divorces, and trust conflicts. When documentation is strong but not yet fully revealed, the opposing side often increases pressure instead of reconsidering position. They try to force resolution before structure becomes visible. One of the attorneys representing the opposing family leaned forward during the discussion and summarized their position bluntly: Emily was being uncooperative, emotionally driven, and not aligned with what's best for the children's stability. It was a framing tactic, not a legal conclusion, but in environments like this, perception often gets treated as momentum. The irony, however, was that the very stability they were claiming to protect depended on the contents of the sealed file they were trying to minimize. Inside it were trust protections, financial responsibility allocations, and custody-linked legal structures that determined long-term security for the children, not emotional agreements negotiated under pressure. Still, the pressure continued to build. Later that afternoon, in a quieter hallway outside the courtroom, a family member attempted a softer approach. They spoke to Emily in a tone meant to sound supportive, suggesting that strong mothers know when to let go and that peace matters more than technical details. It was not hostility, it was persuasion wrapped in concern. But beneath it was the same objective, secure settlement before the full legal structure was examined in detail. Emily listened without reacting. She had heard every version of that argument before, just in different language. What they called letting go, she understood as potentially surrendering documented protections. What they called peace, she recognized as premature closure without full legal clarity. The most dangerous assumption in the entire case was not malice, it was speed. The belief that resolution should come before understanding. Pressure works precisely because it pushes people to confuse relief with correctness. It encourages quick signatures, early agreements, and emotional decisions framed as practical necessity. In custody and financial disputes, that pressure often leads people to give away rights they did not fully realize they were protecting. And that was the core lesson quietly unfolding beneath every conversation in this case. People under pressure tend to settle too early, accept incomplete terms, or agree to arrangements just to stop discomfort. But in structured legal systems, early settlement without full review can permanently transfer control over assets, custody rights, or financial responsibility structures that cannot be easily reversed later. Walter finally broke his silence briefly in a low, calm tone, not directed at anyone in particular, but more like an observation shaped by experience. The people who understand financial and legal systems rarely respond to pressure the way others expect. They do not rush to end discomfort. They wait for structure to be fully visible. As the next hearing approached, one question began to quietly define the entire situation without being spoken aloud in the room. Why was Emily refusing to settle so decisively when everyone around her believed the rational path was compromise? The answer, still locked inside the sealed custody and trust legal file, had not yet been fully revealed. And once it was, the assumption that she was the one under pressure would begin to reverse entirely. The courtroom fell into a silence that was heavier than any argument that had come before it, not because anyone demanded it, but because the sealed custody and trust legal file had finally been opened, and the contents inside no longer allowed interpretation, only recognition. The judge instructed the clerk to proceed page by page, and the first document revealed was the trust allocation record tied directly to the children's future. It clearly identified the structure of financial protection established years earlier, outlining who was responsible for maintaining continuity and who had legal authority over specific custodial financial decisions. There was no emotional language in it, only signatures, dates, and enforceable clauses. The second layer was the deed and custody-linked property structure. Contrary to the assumptions repeated throughout the dispute, the documentation showed that the legal framework governing the suburban home was not based on informal family agreement, but on a structured trust arrangement tied to custody protection. The name listed under controlling authority was not the loudest voice in the room, nor the party applying pressure for settlement. It was the individual who had maintained legal compliance with the structure over time. As the clerk continued reading, another set of records came forward: mortgage continuity documents and financial responsibility logs. These were not symbolic. They showed who had consistently ensured payments were maintained, who carried structured financial obligations during separation, and how those obligations interacted with custody protections. The courtroom did not react with noise, it reacted with stillness, because the implications were already clear without commentary. Then came the bank and trust financial records. These documents mapped out contributions, responsibilities, and structured financial support tied directly to the children's care. They confirmed something. The opposing side had repeatedly dismissed. Financial stability in this case was not defined by perception or status, but by documented continuity over time. A final section of the file contained something that shifted the emotional temperature of the room entirely: a signed responsibility confirmation and trust-linked authorization chain. It outlined who had written key financial planning structures, who had reviewed them, and who had objected or failed to participate in compliance at critical stages. In other words, it identified not just financial involvement, but structural authorship of responsibility. By the time the judge reached the final pages, the narrative that had been pushed throughout the case no longer matched the documentation in front of the court. The idea that Emily Carter was unprepared, unsupported, or lacking authority did not survive contact with the records. What emerged instead was a legally structured picture of continuity, responsibility, and protected custody-linked financial planning. The opposing side did not interrupt. There was no need to. The documents had already done what arguments could not. Walter Gaines finally spoke, not to the room, but in a calm voice that carried the weight of experience rather than emotion. He said simply, "Money gets loud when people lie. Proof gets quiet when it is true." No one responded, because there was nothing to argue against. The statement did not challenge opinions, it aligned with what had just been read line by line in official record form. Emily remained still. Not because she was unaffected, but because nothing new had been revealed to her. The file had confirmed what she had already spent years understanding: legal structure does not reward urgency, emotion, or pressure. It rewards documentation, consistency, and compliance over time. Across the room, the opposing attorneys began quietly revising their posture. Not verbally, but in the subtle way professionals do when they realize the structure of a case has shifted beneath their assumptions. The case was no longer about persuasion. It was about correction. The judge requested a recess before any further arguments, citing the need to review the newly confirmed trust and custody documentation in full legal context before proceeding with any settlement discussion. As the courtroom slowly began to empty, one reality remained unspoken but understood by everyone present: everything that would happen next would not be decided by pressure, family expectation, or negotiation strategy. It would be decided by what the court recognized as legally binding structure. And the consequences of that recognition were only just beginning to unfold. After the recess, the courtroom returned with a different kind of tension, no longer driven by argument, but by consequence. The judge had reviewed the sealed custody and trust legal file in full, line by line, and what followed was not emotional reaction, but procedural correction. The first official confirmation came from the court clerk reading the judge's directive: the custody-linked trust structure was legally valid, properly executed, and enforceable under state family and estate law. That single confirmation shifted everything that had been treated as negotiation back into its proper category: compliance with existing legal structure. The attorney representing Emily Carter stood and formally requested recognition of the trust documentation as controlling authority over custody-linked financial protections. The judge agreed, stating that the court would proceed based on verified records rather than contested settlement interpretations. In practical terms, that meant the trust structure was no longer being debated, it was being enforced. One of the first consequences was the suspension of all proposed settlement terms that conflicted with the trust framework. Any agreement previously drafted under pressure conditions was flagged for review under voluntary consent standards. The court noted that any signature obtained without full disclosure of governing trust clauses required reassessment before enforcement could continue. Next came property and deed-related clarification. The judge reviewed the custody-linked property structure and acknowledged that the deed arrangement tied to the suburban home was governed by the trust, not informal family negotiation. That meant any assumption about shared control based solely on occupancy or emotional arrangement was legally insufficient. The deed structure, as filed, took priority. The mortgage and financial responsibility history was then formally entered into the record. Payment continuity was verified not as ownership proof, but as evidence of structured compliance under the trust arrangement. This distinction mattered because it clarified who had been fulfilling legal obligations aligned with custody protection requirements over time. Bank and trust financial records followed, confirming consistent allocation of funds toward the children's designated financial protections. The court recognized these records as part of the broader fiduciary structure, reinforcing that financial stability in this case was governed by documented responsibility rather than informal agreement. As each layer of documentation was confirmed, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from anticipation to procedural finality. There was no confrontation left to resolve in emotional terms. The system had already decided the framework: enforce what was documented, correct what was inconsistent, and suspend what was improperly executed. Emily Carter remained composed throughout the process. She did not celebrate, and she did not react dramatically. Her response was consistent with everything she had shown from the beginning: attention to structure rather than emotion. The younger white woman who had been underestimated throughout the case was now recognized through documentation, not argument. Walter Gaines observed quietly as the legal outcome unfolded. He did not interfere because there was nothing left to influence. Instead, his presence served as a reminder of a principle that had quietly defined the entire case: financial and legal systems do not reward intensity, they reward alignment with records. Later, as the judge summarized the court's position before adjourning, a clear procedural checklist was effectively reinforced through the outcome of the case: keep records that can survive scrutiny, read contracts before pressure replaces clarity, know exactly whose name is on the title before assumptions are made. track cash flow and responsibility over time, protect signatures from emotional distortion, and never confuse approval under pressure with true legal security. Most importantly, the court reaffirmed what this entire dispute had demonstrated: emotion cannot replace proof, and pressure cannot override documented structure. With that, the custody-linked trust structure was formally upheld, and all future proceedings were ordered to align with the verified documentation rather than prior settlement assumptions. The children's financial protections, as defined in the trust, remained intact under court supervision. As the courtroom slowly cleared, one final question lingered, not in the legal record, but in the space between perception and reality. What happens when a person who is underestimated turns out to be the only one who understood the structure from the beginning? The answer was not yet spoken aloud in court. But it was already written in the documents that had just been enforced. After the courtroom emptied and the formal rulings were entered into record, what remained was not tension anymore, but clarity. The case surrounding Emily Carter was no longer defined by competing narratives, but by something far more permanent: documented structure that had been verified, reviewed, and enforced under law. There was no dramatic victory speech. No public declaration. No emotional collapse or celebration. Instead, there was a quiet reset of reality inside the system that had once been used to pressure her into settling. What had been treated as a negotiation problem was now recognized as a documentation and compliance matter. At the center of it all was a simple but powerful truth that had been present from the beginning: people who understand money, ownership, and law do not rely on performance to establish control. They build systems that do not need to be defended loudly because they are already protected quietly through structure. The custody and trust framework in this case was not created in reaction to conflict. It existed before the pressure ever arrived. That is what ultimately determined the outcome. Not emotion. Not persuasion. Not status in the room. Structure. Emily's position, which had been questioned and minimized throughout the dispute, was ultimately validated not because she argued louder, but because she had maintained alignment with records that were never dependent on interpretation. Her authority in this situation came from ownership documentation, financial continuity records, and legally binding trust structures that existed independently of opinion. Across every stage of the process, one pattern repeated itself: those who relied on perception struggled when confronted with documentation. Those who relied on documentation did not need to struggle at all. They simply waited for verification. Walter Gaines observed this outcome the same way he had observed everything before it, not as a personal win or loss, but as a demonstration of how financial reality actually works when emotion is removed from the equation. His role was never to intervene or rescue. It was to recognize structure when others were still reacting to appearance. In his quiet presence, the lesson became even clearer: wealth, when understood properly, is not about visibility. It is about enforceable alignment between ownership, responsibility, and record-keeping. Cash flow matters. Contracts matter. Signatures matter. But only when they are supported by discipline in how they are created, stored, and executed over time. The younger woman at the center of the case learned something that cannot be taught through pressure, only through experience. Family expectation, emotional manipulation, and public perception all lose power when confronted with properly maintained legal and financial documentation. The moment she stopped responding to pressure and continued relying on structure, the dynamic of the entire case shifted. She was no longer defined by how others described her. She was defined by what the documents confirmed. And that is the core identity lesson that emerged from everything that happened. People who understand money do not need to perform power. They do not rely on noise, status, or reaction. They build quiet systems that protect them when circumstances change. Systems based on ownership records, cash flow tracking, legal contracts, verified signatures, and disciplined documentation. They do not confuse approval with security. They do not mistake pressure for urgency. And they do not allow emotional environments to override structured truth. In the end, this case was never just about custody, trust structures, or financial responsibility. It was about the difference between looking powerful and being protected. One depends on perception. The other depends on records that can survive scrutiny. Emily's final position was not one of victory over others, but of alignment with structure that had always been there. And Walter's presence throughout the entire process quietly reinforced the same principle: calm timing, disciplined records, and respect for legal structure will always outlast pressure-based decisions. What remained after everything was settled was not conflict, but clarity about how stability is actually built. Not in moments of crisis, but long before them, in the quiet decisions no one sees: how documents are kept, how terms are read, how ownership is recorded, and how responsibility is protected. Because in the end, when everything is tested, only one thing consistently holds its ground: proof that was prepared long before it was needed. Do not spend your life trying to look powerful. Build a life where the truth, the records, and the assets can protect you when the room turns against you.